Hello and welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded Oxford Clay, an eco-conscious pottery company. So on this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things pottery related, often with an eco-conscious twist, and I can't wait to share it with you. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. This week we're going to be talking about slip casting, and we're going to be talking about what slip casting is. You might have heard of slip casting, we might have tried to do slip casting or seen something that has been slip cast. So we're going to be talking about that, all about slip casting and how I learned to slip cast, in case you're kind of interested about like how a person learns how to do that. We're just going to be going through all the different aspects of it. So let's get going. Okay, so first of all, what is slip casting? So slip casting is a kind of genre of making pottery which involves pouring liquid clay into a plaster mould. Okay, so the first thing to say is that it's not just normal clay that's used. So basically it'll either be like a special combination of clay, either bought in liquid form from a pottery supplier, or some potters like me make their own clay from different kind of powdered clays and rocks. But the essential thing that's different about slip that's used for slip casting is that it's got a chemical called a deflocculant added to it. So if you just simply add water to clay, it will never go into this kind of runny state. You need to add a deflocculant to the kind of mixture of sticky clay to enable it to go into this kind of beautiful like liquid pouring form that you need it in order to pour it into your mold and out of your mold. So the essential way that slip casting works is the liquid clay is poured into the plaster mold. It's left there for a certain amount of time, which can vary quite widely depending on the type of clay that's used. And then at the end of that time, the slip is poured out again, and then what's left is a kind of cast. So it will be cast in the shape that the plaster mold is in. And then what happens is it's dried a little bit more, so more water gets sucked out by the plaster. And then because clay shrinks, the clay shape will then come away from the plaster mold. So in terms of like the different types of clay that can be used for casting slip, it can actually be any type of clay. So it can be stoneware clay, earthenware, or porcelain, or even bone china is cast as well. So I use stoneware clay. And what I do is I make a mixture of ball clays, which are from southwest England. And then I've got some crushed rocks, I've got feldspar, I've got quartz in there. And then those all get mixed up with the water. And I also put paper in it, which is really good for stopping cracking in slip cast pottery. And then I mix it all up and add the deflocculant, and then it goes into this like beautiful liquid. And then I actually cast my things for about 45 minutes. But on the other end of the spectrum is like a bone china or a porcelain, and porcelain can maybe be cast for like 10 minutes and that's it, and then it's poured out, and then the shape can then be removed after a little bit more drying. So let's talk about the types of molds then that are used for slip casting. So this really confused me actually when I first started trying to slip cast. So I actually didn't know anything about slip casting before I started and I got very, very confused by the mold situation. So molds can either be one-piece molds where the shape will be able to be removed from the mold, so without any overhangs. So let me just show you what I mean by that. So something a bit like this kind of shape, which if you're listening on the podcast, I'm holding up like a little dish. If you imagine like a bowl where the sides kind of just go out, so there's no overhangs, there's nothing that's going to, like if you're casting, this one has little feet that I've added afterwards, but if you can imagine like a smooth kind of shape that's going out, so the sides, so it's becoming wider, there's nothing to stop that shape, the kind of bowl shape, from being lifted out of a one part mold basically when you pour the slip into it. But if you have a shape where there's some kind of overhang, you will need a more than one part shape. You'll need either a two-part shape where basically the two sides kind of come together, and then you can, if you think about like maybe a mug with a handle, that could be cast as one shape, and but you would need so you could cast a mug, but you would need a two-part mold in which to do it, because that handle would not be able to come out of like a one-part mold, if that makes sense. It wouldn't be able to drop out the mold because the handle would be stopping it from coming out. So if you think about like a vase shape, some like vases, say like they have, an overhang, like where say like maybe the neck goes out a little bit. That could be cast as a two-part mold, and then it could even be a three-part mold. Like perhaps there'll be another part on the base, which will all come together and make a kind of container ready for the slip to be poured in and then poured out. And if you're casting with a multi-part mold, so like 2 halves or 3 parts, you'll need something called a mold strap to hold everything together. So these are kind of super strong straps. You can just get them from pottery suppliers, and they basically hold your molds together. Some people use really strong kind of like rubber bands type things, but a mold strap is a kind of it's a really strong strap that you then like kind of, it's got like a metal clip that you kind of like close, and it will like really clamp the mold together. So that essentially is kind of like how slip casting pieces are made, and then like the types of molds basically that are available. And you can make your own molds out of plaster. So that's plaster of Paris, where you kind of mix the plaster of Paris and then cast a shape. So you can cast all sorts of things. You can cast I cast some of the shapes I use from catering equipment. So like one's a Pyrex bowl, which was really good because it's like super smooth and came away from the plaster really well. And then another shape I used was like a pie dish, an enamel pie dish, and I cast that with plaster. So if you're interested in kind of learning how to make plaster molds, there's loads of videos on YouTube. I actually spent ages watching videos of other people casting shapes just to try and understand like what kind of shapes you could cast and how to do it. So there's loads of videos on YouTube about how to do that. But if you want to read it in a book, I also, the best book I found on mould making was this book called The Essential Guide to Mould Making and Slip Casting by Andrew Martin. And I bought this from a secondhand bookstop shop, and it's absolutely fantastic. So it basically goes through like how to make molds, how they work, how to make slip. There's like slip recipes in here as well, and it's such a good book. If you want the definitive guide basically on slip casting, that is the book you want. So I'd really recommend that. But also like I said, like YouTube videos. There was one time where I couldn't remove the thing I was trying to cast from my plaster. It basically got stuck because you have to use some kind of agent to kind of separate the thing you're casting and the plaster. So normally, I looked up and different people use different things, but you can use oil, you can use WD-40, you can use this thing called Mold Maker's Size, which is like a soap type stuff. So people use various different substances to kind of create that kind of barrier so the plaster doesn't stick to whatever thing you're casting when you first make your mold. And there was this YouTube video of this man kind of like, chiseling away, like, trying to separate his mold, which was like really good to know. I was like, oh, how does this work? But like I said, you can also buy them from like pottery suppliers. So if you just want to like maybe try out slip casting, if you want like a little mold or something, they are really good because they're like already made for you and like really, really nice shapes as well. Yeah, and just to say as well, if you wanted a slip casting recipe, there's actually a slip casting recipe in the book Eco-Friendly Pottery, 30 Simple Ways to Make Your Pottery Practice More Ethical and Sustainable. I spent a really long time experimenting with different, quantities of clay, different quantities of quartz, feldspar, and I found it really difficult to find a recipe that was not prone to cracking as it was drying. So I finally found a recipe, and this is the recipe I use for my own slip casting now. And it has, like I said, it has paper added to it. So it has kitchen roll added to it that actually stops the cracking as well. And it's got quite a high percentage of ball clay, which also stops cracking, which Andrew Martin talks about in his book, how you can increase ball clay if your casting slip is cracking a lot. And I finally found a recipe that didn't crack. And so if you want a casting slip recipe, if you're making your own casting slip, there's a recipe in the Eco-Friendly Pottery book, which is available from the Oxford Clay website or Amazon as well. Yeah, okay, so the final thing to say really is just like the kind of benefits and drawbacks of slip casting. So from a potter's perspective, so I have to say, like, slip casting is not something I did at pottery evening classes. It was much more focused around making things on the wheel and, hand building sculpture and, making things like really sort of creatively. So I suppose like the thing about slip casting is, in a way, it can be like less creative, because once you've made the mold, the creative aspect of it is basically going to be kind of in the decoration, or anything you put on, anything you add on. You can maybe decorate it in a certain way, or add little bits of clay on, like little feet, or could be pushing a design into the clay, or it could be adding some kind of raised design to your clay. So there is creativity involved in slip casting, but it's less of a kind of creative process in a way, because you're basically just kind of pouring clay in and pouring clay out. But the good thing about it is that it really lets you get consistency in terms of shapes. So that was what really drew me to it. So although that's why, like, I'd never done it before, I started Oxford Clay, I'd never done it. So I spent a long time like researching how to do it, because I really, really wanted consistent shapes. So it's a really good way of doing it. If you're great at throwing and you can throw bowls that are like the same size and shape the whole time, then that's amazing. But I just knew, for me, it was really nice for me to know that my shapes are always going to be like the same, relatively the same size and shape. That's what I wanted, really, so I could make a kind of pottery product. So yeah, it's really, really good for that. Or if you want to make a set of something, for example, it's really good for that. Everything will be the same size and shape. So consistency of shape, that's a really good way, a really good reason to slip cast. Another drawback actually of slip casting is that slip castings are much more prone to warping than if you throw something on the wheel. So I've done a whole episode actually on warping, and there are loads of things you can do to kind of try and prevent warping. But some things that I found to be helpful in terms of slip casting are trying to make sure that the sides of a pot are like even thickness. Because quite often when you're slip casting, it's really easy for, like, if you're pouring the clay out of one side and not the other, it's actually very easy to make one side a little bit thicker than the other, and that can make a pot really prone to warping. And another thing that I found was that if I made very thin things, they would also warp as well. But I think that was less in terms of slip casting and more in terms of the fact that like I was using like a feldspar, which was kind of melting a little bit in the kiln. But definitely what I've tried to do now is make the slip cast items a bit thicker, and that will really stop the warping as well. That's really helped. And also to say that we covered this a little bit already, but slip castings are also potentially prone to cracking. So when you're making a pot on the wheel, because you're applying pressure, you're really kind of bonding those clay molecules really together, and it's like it can be a very strong pot. Like, if you're pushing down on the base, it makes the base very strong. Whereas slip cast items don't have that same kind of bonding together of the molecules. So what I was finding was bits that were thicker were actually cracking a lot. And like I said, I remedied that by increasing the ball clay and also adding paper basically to my casting slip recipe, which really helped. But those are the potential problems, and they can be really annoying if you're trying to slip cast, and you're trying to make a mold and you're trying to find the right slip recipe. It can be quite a long kind of process of like trial and error. So if you did want a recipe, I'd really recommend that book from Oxford Clay. I'd really recommend, if you want to learn how to make your own mold, I would really recommend either the numerous like YouTube videos available, or The Essential Guide to Mold Making and Slip Casting by Andrew Martin, where he just goes through basically how to make a mold just from the beginning to the end, which is really good. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode on slip casting. It was such a mysterious thing to me when I first started, Oxford Clay, but I was really determined to learn all I could about it, and keep on trying, keep on practicing, even though it did go wrong a lot. But it is really cool. It's a really great way of making pots, and you can then really focus on the kind of the decoration, adding things to your pot, and it is it's a really satisfying way of making a pot. So so really excited to see you next time on the Oxford Clay podcast, and until then, happy potting.